Welcome to Thinking Like a Lawyer with your hosts Ellie Mistal and Joe Patrice, talking about legal news and pop culture, all while thinking like a lawyer. Here on Legal Talk Network.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Thinking Like a Lawyer. I'm Joe Patrice from Above the Law. I am joined again after a week's absence by my co-editor, Catherine Rubino. How are you?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I am good, as well as can be expected. We missed you last week, but we had a very interesting discussion about government and so on. And now we're going to get into more of the nuts and bolts of government today, because we're going to be talking about elections.
Well, it is sort of the thing that everyone is worried about and focused on, and it seems very timely, to say the least.
Exactly. And I also found that I was getting a lot of questions from people who say, just people I know who aren't in the legal community who say, oh, you know, you're a lawyer. Explain to me how this works. And I go, oh, I don't know.
100%. Yeah. My best friend from growing up's mom, who recently got registered to vote for the first time ever.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome, but very concerned about absentee balloting and ran me through all of her options. But I was like, this is the best of my understanding. I'll come back to you in a week or so when I get more information.
Yeah. And yeah, it's just one of those things that people are worried about. And the other things that people are worried about are you worried about a contract deadline? Contract Tools by Paper Software is the most powerful, versatile, and full-featured Microsoft Word add-in for contracts. For less than $1 a day, Contract Tools can help you navigate complex legalese, fix common contract drafting problems, and much more. See for yourself with a 7-day free trial. Go to papersoftware.com/trial and get started today. That was as seamless as I thought I could do it.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So today we are, as we said, we're going to be talking about elections. So we brought back, for those of you who've been listening to this show for a while,
friend of the show,
you will recognize a routine guest. We brought back Professor Rick Hasen from UCI Law, who is now helping out at CNN with their election law coverage. Welcome.
Great to be with you again.
Yeah. So actually, let's start with the again part. So right after the Iowa caucuses, we had you on and we talked a little bit about that screw up. And the real theme at the time for you was, because you just put out a new book and it was perfect timing, but your theme was that we need more education in this country about the way in which elections, aren't going to be, we had kind of a lack of patience, and we believe everything has to happen now or else it's somehow broken, and we needed to train people better about the actual process. So how is that going?
Not well.
Oh, dear.
Well, when we had our discussion, it was the before times.
Right.
Yes.
And I was already worried. My book is entitled Election Meltdown for a reason. I'm worried about the way we run our elections. And if we make it through November successfully, it won't be because we've made enough improvements. It'll be because we got lucky. But now with the coronavirus, I feel like things are just so much worse. So ordinarily, you wouldn't see a state like Pennsylvania or Michigan that has moved to allowing anyone to vote by mail to have just a flood of ballots. But now they're going to. And unlike places that vote all by mail, like Washington or Utah, or places that have a lot of vote by mail, like California or Arizona, there are going to be some places where they've had almost no vote by mail, where it's just exploding. And that's going to create a whole bunch of difficulties, as is trying to vote in person, because polling places are going to be consolidated. You can't use the assisted living center as the polling location. You can't find the poll workers, because who wants to sit in a indoor space with a bunch of strangers for 14 hours? So there's a lot of challenges that are out there. And so, and there's not adequate funding because Congress is not providing enough funding, and the costs are going to be there. So things are going to be sloppier. And so things are just much worse than when we spoke in February.
I was one half of me was hoping that the pandemic was going to have the slight positive effect of no one really in their right mind believes that we're going to have election results immediately on November, like at 8 p.m. we will find out everything.
We have results in.
Which was one of the problems, was that people had become accustomed to that. And I thought, oh, well, knowing that voting by mail is out there, maybe people will be a little more understanding that it's going to take a few days. But yeah, no, you just listed a whole bunch of other worse problems.
Yeah, it is possible that we will, by the time at least those of us on the West Coast go to sleep, but we will know who's won the election. But that will be not an official call. Official results of an election don't come until weeks later. Mm-hmm. There are always errors made in terms of sending in vote totals. Things have to be double checked. Ballots that were sent by mail, including military ballots, need to be counted. But if there's enough evidence that those who study in detail election patterns can say who's won, then we might know the winner. And so unlike Pennsylvania, which does not have a history of being able to process vote by mail ballots quickly, Florida does. If, say, Biden wins Florida, then it could be an early night. Yeah. I'm not saying that there's no way we're going to know, but I think we have to prepare for disaster. And disaster would be such a close election that we don't know, and a protracted administrative and legal and potentially political fight over who's won the election.
Yeah, I know we've heard a lot about sort of a blue shift, that it's very likely, or possible at the very least, that the person who has the most votes on election day will not ultimately be declared the winner, and that a lot of these mail-in or absentee ballots can potentially shift the presumed winner from red to blue. Do you have any thoughts about that and how sort of the education on those issues is going nationwide?
So we issued a report, an ad hoc committee of leaders in law, tech, media, and politics, called Fair Elections During a Crisis. And you could Google that term, Fair Elections During a Crisis, and you'll find our report. And we made two related recommendations about this. One is that the media needs to educate about things being too early to call. That's what we've talked about, but also that partial vote totals are not necessarily going to be predictive of the winner. Mm-hmm. And this is the so-called blue shift. So in 2018, in the congressional races in Southern California, where I live, I believe there were 7 races where Republicans were ahead on election night, where Democrats ultimately won those races. Now you might say, well, why is that? Does that indicate some kind of cheating? And there's no evidence of cheating. There's only evidence that Democrats tend to vote later than Republicans, and Democrats made a big push to have ballots cast early, including by mail. Mm-hmm. And so as those later arriving ballots came in, they were disproportionately Democratic. If that's the pattern we see, and there's reason to believe that we're going to see that pattern even more as Trump discourages his own supporters from voting by mail by casting doubts over the integrity of the system, then it is possible that Trump's ahead in Pennsylvania or another state on election night, only to see, as Philadelphia finally gets its vote totals in, or Detroit and Michigan, that Biden's won. And so there has been, I think, a fair amount of education. Now, most people, they're not political junkies like I am and like you guys are, and you're reading every story. Oh, look what Vox just posted. It's so exciting. Most people are going to get this along the way. And so, I hope that the news will penetrate through, and I hope that all of the networks and major media organizations are prepared to keep repeating these messages as people come online to paying attention to the election. We've certainly given enough information to election officials and to media and social media companies that they should be prepared for what's coming and prepare the public for it.
So I guess actually you mentioned Trump. I think we should go back to one really burning question that we don't really have a great answer to. I know that some legal luminaries have been asked about it. Is it legal for you to vote twice? The Attorney General didn't have an answer. So just can you do that?
So the short answer is no, under both federal law and state law. Now, if somebody goes to the polling place because they voted by mail and they're worried that they didn't get confirmation, as you can in many states, that their vote was received, and they say, look, I don't know if my vote was received, and they cast what's called a provisional ballot, a ballot that's held on the side until they determine whether or not it's valid. I don't think that's going to be a crime, at least to the extent that these are We're talking about willful violations of the law. But it's a pretty bad idea to do this. My advice to everyone is not vote early and often, but vote early. If you vote early in person or you vote early by mail, in many states with vote by mail, you can get some confirmation that your ballot's been received. And then you can relax on election day knowing your job is done in terms of voting. So, but it's just this idea that Trump put out there that you're going to test the system by voting more than once is profoundly irresponsible, because it's going to increase the already long lines at polling places. It's going to decrease people's trust in the process, and it's potentially opening up some people to committing felonies, which is just completely irresponsible.
Well, this gets to some of the logistical questions that people ask me and say, "Oh, you're a lawyer. How does this work?" And I have to say, I don't know. When you mention confirmation, so we've heard, there's confirmation. And one thing that somebody asked me was, well, how does that work and my ballot still be secret? And I hazarded at a guess, but I didn't really know, but I tried to work something out. But how do you get confirmation that your ballot's received while it still remains secret? And how do they keep track of where it is at all times?
Sure. So every state has their own rules. So I can only speak generally about what many states do. This is one of the features of an election system with 10,500 different election administrators simultaneously running an election.
Sounds so terrible, even in the best of times.
I'm trying to sound cheerful. But the most common thing is that there's tracking on the outer envelope. Ballot tracking, like a barcode.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so your ballot is scanned when it goes out. It has tracking on it through the Postal Service if you're returning it that way, or you're putting it in a Dropbox. It gets scanned when it arrives back in. And they're processing the outer envelope, not the inside secrecy envelope where you put your ballot, but the outside envelope that has your signature or your identification information, the kind of anti-fraud provisions that the president pretends don't exist with mail-in ballots. And after they've confirmed that your signature matches or whatever it is, then it'll be recorded that your ballot has been received and accepted. The ballot will then be taken out of the envelope, not connected to your name, and will be put into a pile for counting. So that's how you preserve both the secret ballot and the ability to know that your ballot has been received and is ready to go.
Okay, good. So now that brings to the next question is, when people talk about these drop boxes that some jurisdictions are putting together, I was asked, how do we know how secure those are? I don't know are those drop boxes actually in government buildings and secure locations, or are they taken away every night or something? Just somebody was really freaked out about the security of the drop box process.
So we have 10,500 different election.
Yeah.
I have to play that part of the tape. So everything's different. Some places, no drop box is allowed, right? And a lot of places, you're allowed to drop off your ballot at the polling place, which is, of course, in the presence of election workers and election officials. These drop boxes are typically in public locations, the ones that are on the street. If they're not in a government building, they're outside. There's often video surveillance of these locations. And, there are boxes like mailboxes, so someone can't reach in and get them, and they're fireproof. We know that people might want to tamper with ballots, and so they're designed so that they're secure and in a location where people won't be able to tamper with them.
It's almost like people have thought about this before, huh?
Yeah, it's funny. I was peppering the election officials who run Los Angeles and Orange counties, two huge. Los Angeles is the largest election jurisdiction in the country, with questions that people have been sending me. What if I try to cheat this way? What if I try to cheat that way? And it's like, no, we've thought of that. We
You're not that clever.
It's like, we've been around this block before. People have designed these systems. When fraud happens with absentee ballots, it's typically that it's not in the presence of election officials. It's ballots stolen out of mailboxes or people being paid to vote in a particular way. These tend to be isolated instances. When they do happen in any kind of larger scale, they involve a conspiracy among a lot of people, and they're usually pretty easy to detect, because if you go to vote and you're said, no, you voted already, well, then that becomes a way of finding this out. And so the idea that you'd be able to trick the system and swing the vote in Pennsylvania with thousands of absentee ballots and not be detected is extremely unrealistic if you know anything about how these systems are actually run.
That's something that I've said in the past that I think is true, but this is a good time to test it, which is that all this concern about voter fraud marring a presidential election is somewhat outlandish. If fraud exists, it's, your
dog catcher,
regional supervisor, whatever, where like an election can really be turned on 50 votes here and there. But in trying to coordinate millions of votes to go the other way, it's just really tough to see somebody stealing that many out of mailboxes.
And even that, if you go and you look at lists of actual cases, so the Heritage Foundation has this list of every case since 1982 that they found, many of which turn out to not be fraud at all. But, it's an over-inclusive list. Or you look at this very good database that the News 21 organization put of every prosecution between 2000 and 2012 that was made by American prosecutorial offices. In that database, there are 491 cases, and the vast majority of them involve one-off things, like somebody mailed in an absentee ballot application for someone who didn't request it. Or we just had this case in L.A. Guy forged his dead mother's signature and voted in 3 elections by mail in 2012, 2014, 2016. It's a crime. The guy's going to be punished for it, but it's not going to swing an election.
Yeah.
You could have an election that's decided by one vote. The odds of that happening in the presidential campaign are so tiny. Even Bush versus Gore came down to 500 votes. The idea that you're going to do this on a major scale, extremely unrealistic.
I don't know about that. Bush v. Gore, I think, was a 5-4 vote. But,
well, the conservatives say it was 7-2.
Fair.
They say as a remedies teacher, I was very offended by this line. They say 7 justices agree there were protection problems. The only disagreement is as to the remedy. So, other than what the court's ordering, we're perfectly lined up.
Well, this is a good time to read another brief message, which is how have law firms weathered previous economic downturns and come out stronger on the other side? LexisNexis Interaction has released an in-depth global research report confronting the 2020 downturn, lessons learned during previous economic crises. Download your free copy at interaction.com/likealawyer to see tips, strategies, plans, and statistics from leaders who have been through this before and how they've reached success again. All right. So Catherine.
I want to turn for a minute back to election night and election day. I think that it's kind of been circled on lots of folks' calendar with a bit of apprehension. And there's a lot of things I imagine that you're looking for that day. We talked a little bit briefly already about Florida, that if, Florida is able to make a call quickly and efficiently, that might sort of, predict how the rest of the election's going to go. What are the other sort of key things that you're looking for on election day that will be either good indications that everything's going according to plan, whether it's to the sanctity of the election generally or about, the candidates in particular, or what are the things that you kind of have your eye out for that day?
Let me just clarify on Florida. It's only if Biden wins that
sure.
I think that it would be quick. If it's a Trump victory, then we'll be looking to other states.
Sure.
Yeah. So one thing is, really, it comes down to the margin of victory. Mm-hmm. We're voting, as I'm sure your listeners recall, with an Electoral College total, right? So you have to get to 270 Electoral College votes. It doesn't matter for purposes of choosing the president if one side or the other runs up the score. In fact, there was reporting recently in the New York Times that the Trump campaign has given up on trying to win the popular vote, right? So you might say that the Electoral College system is unfair, but that's the system we have now. And so we're looking at the states that are going to matter to the Electoral College map. Mm-hmm. We're looking at, is it a state that has easily produced results on election night? Is it a state that has seen many more people voting by mail? And how many of those mail ballots have been returned and are outstanding? One of the things that Ohio just announced recently is that they're going to, when they release their vote totals, they're going to say, here's how many absentee ballots have not yet been returned. And I think that's something that kind of reporting is very helpful, rather than saying 100% of precincts reporting. When you see that language, that's only referring to in-person voting, at least in most places. And so, I'll be looking to see what's still left to be counted. And, I'm not the expert that can say, oh, well, look at this county, the vote's still out in this county and they lean heavily Trump or Biden or something like that. I can't tell you that, but that's kind of question that we're looking at. Now, if it turns out that by the time I go to sleep on the West Coast, we don't know who's won Pennsylvania, then everyone's going to be looking at their copy of the Pennsylvania election code. Everyone's going to be zeroing in on Philadelphia. There's going to be a press conference where they're going to talk about how many ballots are left to be counted. You're going to have claims by the parties about what's going on. You're going to have reports of problems because there are always problems in every election. And this election, there are going to be more problems because it's coronavirus. And there's going to be a lot of disinformation. And so one of the things I'm going to be looking at is for election officials and government officials to be out there correcting misinformation, because it's so easy for people to believe that which is on their side. The mail truck that got hijacked, the ballots that were found in somebody's trunk. You hear this, someone voted 20 times. You hear all of these stories, and the allegations always get much more attention than the corrections that come later.
Sure.
One thing that happened here in New York in our primaries was that we had a race where they just didn't count a bunch of ballots for weeks on end, it seemed, because we had a rule in place that the absentee ballots couldn't even be looked at until after everything else had been counted. And that, of course, under our current conditions, led to that dragging out a long time. I've heard rumblings of certain jurisdictions saying they're going to change their rules and start counting absentees as they receive them, just so they don't get caught up in a flood. Is that something that more states should do, or is there a reason why they should stick with the procedures that they know rather than try and make a change?
So let's differentiate between the counting of the ballots and the processing of the ballots.
Okay.
I don't think there should be any counting before Election Day. Counting doesn't really take that long. Assuming you're using machines that scan, typically you fill them in with a pen or a pencil, they're scanned by an optical scanner and the results pop out. That doesn't take all that long. What takes a long time is the processing of the ballots before. When we were talking about earlier, the barcodes and all of that, they're checking your signature in some states. They have computer software that initially checks your signature. If it passes, your ballot goes on to the next step. If it doesn't, there's a human visual check. If there's a problem that your ballot is rejected because your signatures don't match, and that happens a fair amount because, a lot of people's signatures change over time, or they've signed their signature for their voter registration on one of those electronic pin pads at the DMV, where, it's very hard to create a good signature. In a lot of states, you have the chance to cure your ballot. You're contacted by election officials and given a chance to come in and say, no, that's really my signature. The more that pre-counting stuff can happen before Election Day, the better off we're going to be. And there's now a fight in both Michigan and Pennsylvania with Republicans opposing allowing the processing of these absentee ballots before Election Day. I think it's a crucial change that should be made, because that change means there will be less pressure on election officials on Election Day, and we're more likely to get more results more quickly. We definitely want that. We don't need the count before Election Day, but we do need as many of those ballots processed as possible. And with people voting early, there's going to be plenty of work that election officials could do before Election Day to get us in the position to get us to a quicker vote with integrity in the processing and the counting of the ballots.
So another COVID-related question, which actually, this one I felt pretty ashamed of not knowing an answer to, because even though I've lived in New York for a long time at this point, I'm originally from Oregon, so I've lived through an entity that votes entirely by mail. And I was asked, well, with COVID and all these people getting evicted around the country, what's going to happen with them if everything's tied to your mailing address? And I went, I have no idea what the plan is in that sort of a situation. Is that something that you've been hearing rumblings about what happens when people are being kicked out of their homes?
Right. Well, there's that concern, and there's a concern about people who are already homeless and how they're going to vote. Now, the thing is, there are steps that people who are evicted or who are homeless can take in order to be able to vote. There are procedures in place, even in states like Oregon, where people can vote in person if they are not at if they don't have the ability to receive vote by mail, or maybe they have a disability and they can't vote the ballot as it's sent in the mail. But the reality is that for a lot of these people, if you're homeless, voting might be the last thing on your mind. And so one of the problems we have is that turnout is very low among people in economic distress. And yes, more steps need to be taken to try to reach out to those people, because they have the same right to vote as everyone else, and they shouldn't be disenfranchised because they're in poor economic circumstances. But I think it's unrealistic to expect that voting is going to be at the top of the list of someone whose belongings are being tossed out onto the street.
That makes sense. Yeah, the person who asked me that question just said that, they'd read something about how I think it was in Houston, they're about to start evicting like 100,000 people from various rentals, and he was like, "Well, what's going to happen to them if they try to get an absentee ballot?" And I honestly didn't know. But yeah, that's interesting, and obviously true that they have bigger concerns. But cool, that's pretty much all my questions. I don't know if Catherine, do you have anything else? Or?
Well, I mean, I guess is there any sort of takeaway that people who are apprehensive about the election can have, or are there any sort of what can the average person do to ameliorate any of these ongoing concerns without us able to necessarily change the laws in time?
Well, first, for yourself personally, have a voting plan. Mm-hmm. How are you going to vote? When are you going to vote? Vote as early as you can, once your mind is made up and you have your ballot or your ability to go vote in person. So I think having a personal voting plan is important. Because our elections are so decentralized, you can kind of try to influence your local election administrators to make sure they have good plans in place to be transparent about their voting process, to make sure that voters have access to be able to vote, and that there is a process by which the vote counting and all of this can be done transparently. And third, avoid disinformation and misinformation. It's so easy when we're in our echo chambers, everyone working for their team, to think, any news that indicates the other side is cheating must be true. Before you retweet or you share or like or whatever it is that you get to, or swipe, whatever it is you're doing on your social media platform of choice, make sure that you're not part of the problem by spreading misinformation, disinformation. Look for reliable sources of news, because there's going to be a fog of disinformation in the event that things are close. People are going to try to influence things by putting bad information out there.
Yeah. And, on that, making sure you have the correct information, is there a place where, a lot of rules are currently in flux at the moment in different jurisdictions, or they've really recently updated the rules? Is there, where should folks be looking for their local jurisdiction? Is there a sort of clearinghouse, or sort of where are the most reliable sources to find the most up-to-date voting information for individuals?
Well, usually the Secretary of State or Chief Election Officer's website of each state will have something on their website where you can put in your address or your zip code, and it will take you to your local election administrator's page where you can get information. Mm-hmm. There are also a number of websites like USA.gov will get you some of this information. Mm-hmm. And the Washington Post has recently set up a website which helps you, first ask you where you live and then how you're planning on voting, and we'll tell you what your options are, and we'll link to the appropriate official websites to get that information.
Perfect.
Excellent. Yeah. So everyone go out, do that, figure out what's going on.
Do your due diligence before.
Vote as soon as you can to help out the whole system. You're part of the stress on the system, so alleviate that as much as you can. These seem to be the takeaways I'm getting from this, so I'll dutifully make that my election plan.
Yeah, flatten the absentee ballot curve.
There we go. That's a concept that hopefully people understand.
They don't.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, that was far too hopeful. So great. Well, great as always to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us. That was Professor Rick Hasen from UCI Law and the Great Election Law blog. Check him out also on CNN, where he'll be talking about The
All things
election,
elections.
all things election, all the time. And thank you all for listening. You should subscribe to the show if you haven't already. That way you get new episodes when they come out. You should give it a review, not just the stars. Write something. It helps. You should be listening to the Jabot, which is Catherine's show about diversity in law firms and law schools. And you should be listening to our special reports about how COVID is unexpectedly changing the law at the ATL COVID Cast, all the other offerings of the Legal Talk Network. Thank you again to Paper Software for sponsoring the show. Check out Contract Tools and the 7-day free trial. And with all of that said, I think we're now done, and we will check
vote. Remember to vote.
Yes. And we'll check in with everybody next week. Bye.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. You can also find us at AboveTheLaw.com, ATLRedline.com, iTunes, RSS, Twitter, and Facebook. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.